Today, I'm going to tell you the story of Tom Sullivan, a cowboy who gave his coat to a freezing Native American girl. When Tom offered his blanket to White Dove during a blizzard, he had no idea about Crow marriage customs. But this story has an ending that no one saw coming. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening to this story from. A simple act of kindness. The November wind cut through the Montana Territory like a blade, carrying with it the promise of the harsh winter that would soon grip the land in its frozen fist. Tom Sullivan pulled his wool coat tighter as he guided his horse along the narrow trail that wound through the pine forests near the Crow Reservation. At 28, Tom had spent the better part of a decade working cattle ranches across the territory, but he had never grown accustomed to the brutal cold that came with the changing seasons. The sky overhead was a threatening shade of grey, heavy with snow clouds that seemed ready to burst at any moment. Tom's breath formed visible puffs in the frigid air as he urged his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Chester, to maintain a steady pace toward the town of Billings. He was carrying important documents for his employer, ranch owner Marcus Whitfield, and the 20-mile journey needed to be completed before the storm that was clearly brewing decided to unleash its fury. As Tom rounded a bend in the trail, he spotted something unusual ahead. A small figure sat huddled against a large boulder beside the path, barely visible against the grey stone and brown earth. As he drew closer, Tom realized it was a young Native American woman, probably no more than 18 or 19 years old, wearing only a thin dress that offered little protection against the bitter cold. The woman looked up as Tom approached, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of wariness and desperation. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint, and her entire body was shaking uncontrollably from the cold. Tom could see that she was in serious danger of freezing to death if she remained exposed to the elements much longer. "Miss, are you all right?" Tom called out, dismounting from Chester and approaching slowly with his hands visible to show he meant no harm. He had learned from his years in the territory that sudden movements and aggressive postures could be misinterpreted, especially by members of the local tribes who had good reason to be suspicious of white strangers. The young woman tried to respond, but her teeth were chattering so violently that her words came out as unintelligible sounds. Tom could see that she was attempting to pull her thin dress more tightly around her body, but the threadbare fabric provided virtually no warmth against the increasingly brutal wind. Without hesitation, Tom began unbuttoning his heavy wool coat. Underneath, he wore a thick flannel shirt and wool vest that would provide adequate warmth for the short term. "Here," he said gently. "You need this more than I do right now." The woman shook her head weakly, trying to refuse the offer, but Tom could see that pride was the only thing preventing her from accepting help that might save her life. "Please," he insisted, draping the coat around her shoulders. "It's going to start snowing any minute, and you'll freeze to death out here without proper protection." As the warm wool enveloped her, the woman's shivering began to subside slightly. She pulled the coat tighter around herself and looked up at Tom with an expression of gratitude mixed with confusion. It was clear that she hadn't expected such kindness from a white stranger, especially one who appeared to be a cowboy or ranch hand. "What's your name?" Tom asked, settling down on a nearby rock to show that he wasn't in a hurry to leave her alone again. "I'm Tom Sullivan. I work for the Whitfield Ranch about 15 miles south of here." The woman hesitated for a moment before responding in accented but clear English. "I am White Dove," she said quietly. "I am of the Crow people." Tom nodded respectfully. He had encountered members of the Crow tribe numerous times during his years in Montana, and while relations between the tribe and white settlers were often tense, he had always found individual Crow people to be honorable and dignified in their dealings. "White Dove is a beautiful name," Tom said genuinely. "What are you doing out here alone in this weather? Your people's village is quite a distance from this trail." White Dove's expression grew troubled, and she looked away toward the darkening forest. "I was traveling to visit my aunt in the next valley. My horse threw a shoe and went lame about 2 miles back. I had to leave him and continue on foot, but the cold became too much." Tom frowned with concern. The nearest settlement in the direction she indicated was at least 10 miles away, far too distant for someone to travel on foot in these conditions, especially wearing inadequate clothing. That's a dangerous journey to make alone, particularly with winter weather moving in. I had no choice, White Dove replied, her voice carrying a note of sadness that suggested there was more to her story than she was revealing. My aunt is very ill, and I promised to care for her during the cold months. As if summoned by their conversation about the weather, the first snowflakes began to fall from the heavy grey clouds above. What started as a few scattered flakes quickly intensified into a steady snowfall that reduced visibility and made the already cold air feel even more bitter. Tom stood up and looked around, assessing their situation. They were still several miles from Billings, and the storm was clearly going to make travel dangerous, if not impossible. His original plan of reaching town before nightfall was looking increasingly unlikely. White Dove, I don't think either of us is going to make it to our destinations today, he said, brushing snow from his shoulders. This storm is moving in fast, and traveling in a blizzard is a good way to get lost and freeze to death. White Dove struggled to stand, still wrapped in Tom's warm coat. I must continue. My aunt is expecting me, and she needs the medicine I carry. Tom noticed for the first time that White Dove was carrying a small leather pouch, presumably containing whatever healing herbs or remedies she had brought for her aunt. Her dedication to completing her journey despite the obvious dangers impressed him. But he couldn't in good conscience allow her to continue alone in these conditions. There's an old trapper's cabin about a mile from here, Tom said, making a decision that would change both of their lives in ways neither could imagine. It's been abandoned for years, but it should provide shelter until this storm passes. We can build a fire and wait out the worst of the weather. White Dove looked uncertain about the proposal. Spending time alone with a white man in an isolated cabin would be considered highly inappropriate by both her people and his, but the alternative was almost certain death from exposure, shelter from the storm. The abandoned trapper's cabin sat nestled among a grove of tall pines, its weathered log walls and moss-covered roof barely visible through the increasingly heavy snowfall. Tom led Chester by the reins, while White Dove walked beside him, still wrapped in his warm wool coat. The journey that should have taken 15 minutes stretched to nearly an hour as they fought against the wind and deepening snow. "There it is," Tom called out, pointing toward the small structure that appeared through the swirling white curtain of the blizzard. "Old Pete Magnuson built this place back in '74. Haven't seen him in these parts for 3 years now." The cabin was modest but solid, constructed from thick pine logs that had weathered to a silver-grey color. A stone chimney rose from one end, and Tom was relieved to see that it appeared to be in good condition. A small lean-to attached to the side would provide adequate shelter for Chester during the storm. Tom pushed open the heavy wooden door, which creaked loudly on its rusted hinges. The interior was simple but functional. A single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 wooden chairs, and a narrow bed frame in one corner. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs stretched across the corners, but the roof appeared sound, and the walls would keep out the wind. "It's not much," Tom said, stamping snow from his boots, "but it's dry and we can get a fire going." White Dove stepped inside, her dark eyes taking in the surroundings. "It will serve," she said simply, though Tom detected a note of apprehension in her voice. The situation was highly unusual and potentially compromising for both of them. Tom busied himself with practical matters, hoping to ease the awkwardness of their circumstances. He found a cache of dry firewood stacked against the back wall and began arranging kindling in the fireplace. "Pete always kept this place well stocked," he explained as he worked. "Smart man never knew when he might need emergency shelter." While Tom worked on building a fire, White Dove examined the small pouch she carried. She opened it carefully and checked the contents. Various dried herbs, roots, and powdered medicines that her grandmother had taught her to prepare. Everything appeared to be dry and intact, despite her ordeal in the cold. "Your aunt must be very important to you," Tom observed, glancing up from the fireplace where he was coaxing the first flames to life. To risk such a dangerous journey in winter weather. White Dove's expression grew sad. "She raised me after my parents died of the fever when I was 8 years old. She taught me the old ways, the healing arts that have been passed down through generations of Crow women. Now she is old and sick, and it is my turn to care for her." Tom nodded respectfully as he fed larger pieces of wood to the growing fire. "Family is important. I understand why you couldn't wait for better weather." As warmth began to fill the small cabin, White Dove relaxed slightly. She pulled Tom's coat more tightly around herself and moved closer to the fire. "You risk much by helping me," she said quietly. "If your people knew you had sheltered alone with a Crow woman—" "My people can think what they want," Tom replied firmly. "A person doesn't leave someone to freeze to death just because they look different or come from a different tribe." The storm outside continued to intensify, with wind howling through the pine trees and rattling the cabin's shutters. Snow was beginning to pile up against the windows, and Tom realized they might be trapped here for more than just a few hours. "I should tend to Chester," Tom said, standing up from the fire. "He'll need water and some of the hay Pete kept stored in the lean-to." White Dove watched as Tom bundled himself in a spare blanket he'd found and ventured back into the storm. Through the window, she could see him moving around the lean-to, making sure his horse was properly sheltered and fed. The care he showed for his animal impressed her. In Crow culture, the relationship between a person and their horse was considered sacred. When Tom returned, stamping snow from his boots and shaking ice from his hair, he found White Dove kneeling beside the fire, stirring something in a small metal cup she had produced from her pouch. "What are you making?" Tom asked, settling into one of the wooden chairs. "Medicine tea," White Dove replied. "You are cold and wet. This will warm you from the inside and prevent sickness." Tom was surprised by her thoughtfulness. "You don't need to waste your medicine on me. You're saving that for your aunt." "I have enough," White Dove said, offering him the warm cup. "Besides, it would be ungrateful to accept your coat and shelter without offering something in return." Tom accepted the tea and took a cautious sip. The liquid was bitter but warming, with flavors he couldn't identify. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "What's in it?" "Willow bark for pain, pine needle for strength, and other herbs my grandmother taught me to use." White Dove prepared a second cup for herself. "Crow medicine is old and powerful, passed down from mother to daughter for many generations." As they sat by the fire, sharing the herbal tea and listening to the storm rage outside, Tom found himself genuinely curious about White Dove's life and culture. "Have you always lived on the reservation?" he asked. White Dove shook her head. "I was born in the time before, when my people still followed the buffalo herds across the Great Plains. I remember the old camps, the freedom of moving with the seasons." Her voice carried a note of loss. "The reservation is different, smaller, but it is where we must live now." Tom had heard stories about the conflicts between the government and various Indian tribes, but he had never really considered what it meant for individuals like White Dove to have their entire way of life changed so dramatically. "It must be difficult," he said quietly. "We adapt," White Dove replied with dignity. "The Crow people are strong. We find ways to keep our traditions alive, even in changed circumstances." Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the wind seemed to be growing stronger, and the snow was falling so heavily that visibility was reduced to mere feet. Tom realized they would likely be spending the entire night in the cabin together, a situation that would create serious complications for both of them when they returned to their respective communities. When morning brings unexpected visitors, dawn broke cold and clear over the Montana wilderness, revealing a landscape transformed by the night's blizzard. Snow had piled nearly 3 feet deep around the cabin, and icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves. Tom stirred first, awakening from an uncomfortable night spent sleeping on the floor near the fireplace, while White Dove had taken the narrow bed. The fire had burned down to glowing embers during the night, and the cabin was decidedly chilly. Tom quietly added wood to restart the flames, trying not to wake White Dove, who was still wrapped in his wool coat and sleeping peacefully. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world of pristine, white silence. Tom stepped outside to check on Chester and assess their situation. The horse had weathered the storm well in the lean-to, though he nickered softly at Tom's appearance, clearly eager for attention and food. The snow was deep but manageable, and Tom could see that travel would be possible, though slow and difficult. As he was brushing snow from Chester's coat, Tom heard the distant sound of voices carried on the crisp morning air. He paused, listening intently, and realized that multiple riders were approaching the cabin. His heart sank as he recognized the possibility of complications arising from his night spent alone with White Dove. "White Dove!" Tom called softly as he re-entered the cabin. "We have company coming!" White Dove was already awake, sitting up on the bed with an expression of concern. She'd heard the voices, too, and understood the implications immediately. "How many?" she asked, quickly standing and smoothing her dress. "Sounds like 4 or 5 riders," Tom replied, moving to the window to peer through the frost-covered glass. "They're still a few minutes away, but they're definitely heading this direction." White Dove's face grew pale as the full weight of their situation became clear. Spending an unchaperoned night together, regardless of the innocent circumstances, would be viewed as highly improper by both White and Crow communities. The potential consequences could be severe for both of them. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and soon Tom could make out the approaching party through the window. 5 Crow warriors on horseback were making their way through the deep snow toward the cabin, their faces grim with determination. Tom recognized the lead rider as Running Bear, a respected member of the tribal council, and, he suddenly realized with growing dread, White Dove's older brother. "It's my brother," White Dove whispered, confirming Tom's fears. "He must have come looking for me when I didn't arrive at our aunt's lodge." The riders dismounted outside the cabin, and Tom could hear them speaking in the Crow language, their voices carrying tones of anger and concern. Running Bear's voice was the loudest and most agitated, and Tom didn't need to understand the words to recognize the fury in the man's tone. Running Bear pounded on the cabin door with his fist, shouting something in Crow that made White Dove wince. She moved to the door and responded in her native language, her voice defensive but respectful. The conversation that followed was rapid and heated, with Running Bear's voice growing increasingly angry. "What is he saying?" Tom asked quietly. "He demands to know why I am here with a white man," White Dove replied, her voice trembling slightly. "He says our aunt sent word that I never arrived, and the whole village has been searching for me." Tom stepped forward and opened the door, facing the 5 Crow warriors with as much dignity as he could muster. Running Bear was a powerfully built man in his 30s, with traditional braids and paint marking his face. His eyes blazed with protective fury as he looked at Tom. "I am Tom Sullivan," Tom said clearly, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "Your sister was caught in the blizzard and nearly frozen to death. I brought her here for shelter. Nothing improper happened." Running Bear spoke rapidly in Crow to one of the other warriors, who translated Tom's words. The response was swift and angry, with several of the warriors placing hands on their weapons. "My brother says you have dishonored our sister," White Dove translated, her voice filled with distress. "In our customs, a man and woman who spend the night together under one blanket are considered married. He says you must answer for this." Tom felt his blood run cold. He had given White Dove his coat, his blanket in a sense, and they had indeed spent the night together, albeit innocently. "Please explain to your brother that I was only trying to save your life. I meant no disrespect to you or your people." White Dove spoke earnestly to Running Bear in Crow, gesturing toward Tom and then toward herself. But her brother's expression only grew darker, and he began speaking rapidly to the other warriors. Tom could sense the situation escalating dangerously. "What's happening now?" Tom asked. "My brother says that intentions do not matter," White Dove replied, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "According to our laws, you have claimed me as your wife by giving me your covering and sharing shelter. The village council will expect you to honor this commitment or face the consequences." Tom stared at her in disbelief. "What kind of consequences?" Before White Dove could answer, Running Bear stepped forward and began speaking directly to Tom in broken English. "You take sister. You marry sister. Crow law. No choice." The other warriors nodded grimly, and Tom realized he was facing a cultural misunderstanding that could have life-changing implications. He had acted out of simple human kindness to save a young woman's life, but his actions had been interpreted through the lens of Crow marriage customs. "And if I refuse?" Tom asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Running Bear's hand moved to the tomahawk at his belt, and his meaning was unmistakably clear. In Crow culture, a man who dishonored a woman and then refused to make amends would face severe punishment, possibly death. White Dove looked at Tom with an expression of profound sadness and resignation. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I should have warned you about our customs. Now we are both trapped by traditions neither of us intended to invoke." Tom found himself facing an impossible choice: marry a woman he barely knew from a completely different culture, or face the deadly consequences of refusing. The simple act of giving his coat to a freezing woman had somehow transformed him from a bachelor cowboy into an unwilling bridegroom, caught in a web of cultural expectations he had never imagined existed. A marriage, neither expected; a love, neither planned. The silence that followed Running Bear's ultimatum seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the sound of wind whistling through the pine trees and the occasional snort from one of the horses. Tom looked from the grim faces of the Crow warriors to White Dove's tear-filled eyes, understanding that his next words would determine not only his fate, but hers as well. "If I agree to this marriage," Tom said carefully, "what would that mean exactly? Would White Dove be expected to leave her people and live among whites? Would I need to join your tribe?" Running Bear spoke with one of the other warriors before responding in his halting English. "You come to our village, learn our ways, prove you worthy husband for Crow woman." White Dove wiped her eyes and stepped closer to Tom. "In our tradition, when a white man marries into the tribe, he must demonstrate his commitment by living among us for a full season. If he proves himself honorable and capable, the marriage is accepted. If not—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Tom considered his options, which seemed to be limited to marriage or death. But as he looked at White Dove, her dignified bearing despite her distress, her kindness in sharing her medicine tea, her courage in traveling alone to care for her sick aunt, he realized that the situation might not be entirely unwelcome. "White Dove," Tom said quietly, "if we go through with this, I want you to know that I will do everything I can to be a good husband to you, even though neither of us chose this path." White Dove met his eyes, and Tom saw something shift in her expression. "You could have run," she said softly. "When you heard the horses approaching, you could have taken your horse and escaped through the forest, but you stayed to face the consequences of helping me." "Running would have left you to face your brother's anger alone," Tom replied. "That wouldn't have been right." Running Bear had been listening to their exchange with growing impatience. He spoke rapidly to White Dove in Crow, and she nodded reluctantly before turning back to Tom. "My brother says we must return to the village immediately for the ceremony. In Crow custom, once a marriage is acknowledged, it must be completed within 1 day to be valid." Tom felt his heart racing as the reality of the situation settled over him. In less than 24 hours, he would be married to a woman he had met yesterday, becoming part of a culture he barely understood. "What about my job at the ranch? My employer is expecting me to deliver those documents to Billings." White Dove translated his concern to Running Bear, who spoke briefly with the other warriors before responding. "My brother says you can send word to your employer, but you belong to the Crow people now. Your old life is finished." The journey to the Crow village took most of the day, with the group moving slowly through the deep snow. Tom rode Chester, while White Dove shared a horse with one of her brother's companions. As they traveled, Tom found himself studying the landscape with new eyes, realizing that this vast territory would now be his home. The Crow village sat in a sheltered valley beside a partially frozen stream, with dozens of teepees arranged in traditional patterns around a central area. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and Tom could see people moving about their daily activities despite the cold weather. Children played in the snow, while women worked on various tasks outside their homes. The arrival of Running Bear's party caused quite a commotion, with villagers gathering to see the white man who had somehow become entangled with White Dove. Tom felt dozens of eyes upon him, some curious, some hostile, all evaluating this unexpected addition to their community. White Dove's aunt, despite her illness, emerged from her teepee to witness the proceedings. She was an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair braided with colorful beads. When White Dove explained the situation to her, the old woman studied Tom for a long moment before nodding approvingly. "She says you have honest eyes," White Dove translated, "and that any man willing to risk his life to save a stranger possesses a good heart." The marriage ceremony itself was unlike anything Tom had ever experienced. It took place in the center of the village, with the entire community gathered in a circle around Tom and White Dove. The tribal elder, a dignified man named Iron Wolf, conducted the ritual in the Crow language while White Dove quietly translated the important parts for Tom. "He is asking the spirits to bless our union and make it strong like the mountains," she whispered, as Iron Wolf raised his hands toward the sky. "Now he will ask if you accept the responsibilities of a Crow husband." When the moment came for Tom to respond, he found himself speaking from the heart, rather than simply going through the motions. "I accept White Dove as my wife," he said clearly, looking directly into her dark eyes. "I promise to protect her, provide for her, and honor her people's ways." The ceremony concluded with the exchange of symbolic gifts. White Dove gave Tom a pair of moccasins she had sewn, while he presented her with his most prized possession, a silver pocket watch that had belonged to his father. The crowd erupted in celebration, with drumming, singing, and dancing that continued long into the night. As the festivities wound down, Tom and White Dove found themselves alone in the teepee that had been prepared for them as their new home. The awkwardness of their situation was overwhelming, but White Dove broke the tension with a gentle smile. "This is not how either of us expected to find a spouse," she said, settling onto one of the buffalo hide beds that lined the teepee's walls. "No," Tom agreed, sitting across from her. "But perhaps the spirits have a plan we don't understand yet." White Dove nodded thoughtfully. "My grandmother always said that the most important journeys begin with unexpected steps. Perhaps saving my life in that blizzard was the first step of a journey we were meant to take together." Tom looked at his new wife, this brave, intelligent, beautiful woman who had entered his life through pure chance, and felt something stirring in his chest that might in time grow into love. "I guess we'll find out together," he said softly. Outside their teepee, the sounds of the village settling into sleep surrounded them. Tom Sullivan, the cowboy who had simply tried to help a freezing woman, was now a married man, beginning a new life among the Crow people. It wasn't the future he had planned, but as he watched White Dove prepare for sleep with graceful, practiced movements, he found himself thinking it might be a future worth embracing.